We should be live, everybody. Thanks for joining the channel. Happy Friday to you all if you're watching this on a Friday or whatever day you happen to be watching this. This has been an exciting study. Today, I've been looking at Exodus chapter 32, asking the question, what does the NFL stand for? We're going to unpack that as we look at this lesson today. And some of you know I say this almost every time, but this channel exists to reveal Jesus in the Old Testament, where he's foreshadowed, he's prophesied about, and the fulfillment we find in the New Testament scriptures, either specifically about Jesus or about some component of what it means to be a follower of Christ. And today, of course, is no different. This is chapter 32 of Exodus, and it's kind of long, and there's some couple of good, really powerful ideas here. So I thought what I would do is I would break it up over 2 weeks. I'm just going to do the first half today, and then next week do the second half as we take a look at what this chapter has to say about Jesus. So starting in chapter 32, verse 1, when the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." So I don't know about you guys, but this verse sounds a little familiar to me. Doesn't it to you? There are people in the world today who say of Christ followers, followers of Jesus, they would say, yeah, he's coming back soon. You Christians been saying that for centuries, and yet he never returns. But the parallels, you guys, between that sort of thinking and what happened in Moses' time are actually striking. Because when you go back to chapter 19, so was that 13 chapters before this one in Exodus, when you get back to that chapter, you find that Moses is going up on the mountain and God speaks to Moses about the covenant. And then the people respond with what Moses says to them. They say, we will do everything that the Lord your God has said to do, we will do. And so that chapter is considered by most scholars to be the proposal, where God is like a husband to the Israelites, and he's proposing to the nation of Israel, and they're saying, I do. They're saying yes in that proposal. And so, in both Jewish and Christian scholars kind of think that way. Now, in their engagement structures, the proposal and the acceptance of the proposal look a lot like this, because it becomes like, for example, when you, let's say in that culture, you were to propose to a young Jewish, potentially your bride. If she were to say yes, at that point forward, she would be your legal wife. Many of you know this. You don't consummate the marriage until later, but she's still legally bound to you as a wife. And so in this case, Israel was bound to God in a sense as her wife in a sense, because she said yes to the proposal that he made. So then what happens? Well, Moses goes up for 40 days and 40 nights to get the covenant, the 10 commandments, if you will, inscribed by the finger of God in stone. And then he's going to bring them back down to the people. And he comes back down in chapter 32 to the people, God sending him back down with the covenant, with the 10 commandments. But Israel has become restless. They're like, where's our husband? Where's our God? Both his representative and he are gone, and we don't know what's happened to them. You see, in the same way today, Jesus has proposed to the church at the Last Supper. And I've spoken about this extensively in other videos, but the basic idea is that at the Last Supper, the language of what Jesus was speaking and all of the things that took place looked a lot like a Galilean wedding proposal. And so the disciples, who were primarily from Galilee, would have understood what Jesus was doing in that evening. For example, when Jesus says to them, I will not drink, they have the bread and the wine, and he says, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until I drink it with you anew in my Father's kingdom. They knew exactly what he was saying, because that's exactly what a groom would say to his bride. He would, well, not exactly, but to the effect, what the groom would say is, look, I'm going to have this wine with you. It's our covenant wine. They would share it together. And he says, I'm not going to touch this again until we drink it together as a married couple. In essence, that's what he was saying. And so that's what Jesus was saying at that point in time. So the day on the Jewish calendar most associated with Jewish weddings is on the 15th of Av. It's called Tu B'Av. Now, why does that matter? Well, look at verse 2. Aaron answered to the people, said, take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing. Bring them to me. So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. And then they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord. So the next day, the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterward, they sat down to eat and drink, and then they got up to indulge in revelry. Okay, so one can make a pretty strong case that this festival to the Lord that Aaron was speaking of was actually the festival of wine. It was spoken of about by the Essenes in their temple scroll documents that were discovered at Qumran. The festival of wine occurred on the Jewish calendar of Av, but on the third day. So new wine was in abundance during that month. Therefore, weddings began to take place a couple of weeks later and just centered around the 15th of Av, because people wanted to wait till after the 9th of Av, because that was a day that was infamous in Jewish history. And so they wanted to get past that. And so they would get past that to about the 15th. And that became the kind of the target date for weddings. So here, God's coming back to his bride through his representative Moses with the marriage covenant to consummate the wedding at the same time as the Jews would typically later celebrate weddings. Isn't that interesting? But what's his bride doing at that time? Well, unfortunately, she's committing adultery. Well, they worship God, but when the service was over, they immediately got up and indulged in revelry. Revelry, that's a hard word for me to say. You know, they would be drinking wine, they would be dancing, it says later in the text. They probably were committing adultery, they were mocking others. That's definitely included in the meaning of the word. And so in essence, they were doing all of that to worship the golden calf. And the psalmist would later proclaim that Israel exchanged their glory for the image of a bull that eats grass. How foolish. Verse 7. Then the Lord said to Moses, go down, because your people, I love how God changes it now, these are your people, because your people whom you brought up out of Egypt have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and they've made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They have bowed down to it and sacrificed to it and have said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt. I have seen these people, the Lord said to Moses. They are stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that I'm in my anger, I might burn against them and I might destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation. But Moses sought the favor of the Lord and said, O Lord, he said, why should your anger burn against your people whom you brought up out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say it was with evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountains and to wipe them off the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce anger, Moses says, relent, do not bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give your descendants all this land I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever. Then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened. That in and of itself, you guys, is a foreshadow of how Jesus would stand between us and the wrath of God. Jesus was pleading with God on our behalf. Don't count their sin against them, because I'm taking the punishment off. So you have one picture of that there. All right. Moses went down the mountain with the two tablets. I'm in verse 15. Of the testimony in his hands, they were inscribed on both sides, front and back. The tablets were the work of God. The writing was the writing of God engraved on the tablets. When Joshua heard the noise of the people shouting, he said to Moses, there's a sound of war in the camp. Moses replied, it's not the sound of victory, and it's not the sound of defeat. It is the sound of singing that I hear. So Moses, he knows exactly what's going on. They're partying down there. They're worshiping this golden calf, and they're partying, engaged in revelry. So he intercedes for people, and God doesn't destroy him. But why was God angry? Well, imagine that you were proposed to a young lady, and you go to get her on the wedding day, and when you get there, she's engaged in adultery with another man. That's in essence what's happening here with the children of Israel. On their wedding day, they're engaged in adultery with another person. And of course, God is angry. Of course, he's mad, right? That's what's happening. Especially after God had rescued them from slavery in Egypt and gave them a promise of an amazing future, land flowing with milk and honey. So do you see then the parallels between this story and the Christians today? Jesus has proposed to the church. All who put their faith in Jesus and have committed their lives to him are part of the church. Therefore, we are all part of his bride. But like Moses, who ascended the mountain, Jesus has ascended to heaven. And the people are all like, so as far as this fellow Moses is concerned, we don't know what's happened to him. He's been gone a long time. Isn't that what many Christians say today? Yeah, Jesus has been gone for a while. I don't think he's coming back. A lot of Christians will say that. Others might say, well, he's not coming back for a year, so, just relax, right? And so maybe their words don't say he's not coming back, but their actions can definitely say it. And we have to be followers of Jesus who remain faithful to him. The Jews, they got up, had their church service, if you will, and then they went and engaged in revelry. How many Christians are doing the same thing today? We go to church on Sunday, unless if you're on the West Coast and your team's playing on the East Coast, right? I'm a Seahawks, or was a Seahawks fan. I'm not much of a fan of anything anymore in terms of the NFL. But when I was a fan, sometimes the games were on at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. And as a pastor, oftentimes people wouldn't come to church if the Seahawks were having an away game because they wanted to stay home and watch the football game. It's crazy. But what happens normally is across the country is people will get up and go to church, but afterwards they sort of bow down to the altar of the NFL. Isn't that what we do? We're too busy entertained by overpaid athletes in tight pants who try to push the skin of a pig over an arbitrary line. Many believers have traded their glory for the image of a pig that gets kicked around in the grass. How foolish. The NFL has become a false god in our culture in our time. One of many that people run to in order to find meaning and comfort and joy. Now, don't get me wrong. I love the game. I used to play the game in high school, but I don't want to put it ahead of Jesus. And many people do. I watched the film Invincible. I don't know if you've seen that. Mark Wahlberg plays the part, true story, plays the part of Philadelphia Eagles player Vince Papale, who in 1976, he was a walk-on on the Philadelphia Eagles football team. He made the team. It's a great story. But the problem is the pregame speech that Coach Vernell gave to his players is exactly the problem with the NFL in our culture today. What he says that, let's see, I'm looking at my notes here. He says the people of Philadelphia have suffered, but you are what they turn to in times like these. This is what he's saying to his players. You are what gives them hope. And Vince's dad in the story tells him at one point that a certain touchdown from a past Philadelphia Eagle player is what got him through 30 years at the factory. See, it's talk like that gives godlike qualities to the NFL. People turn to the NFL for hope. They do. They plug into that as sort of to pick them up and to lift up their down spirits, if you will, instead of turning to Jesus. That's the picture that you have and the problem that you have with the NFL. But listen, NFL means not for long, right? This is the problems with false gods. They lie to you. They promise joy, but it's not for long. Ultimately, it brings disappointment. Look at every false god. Look at every sinful thing you can engage in. Any hedonistic lifestyle you pursue, it will disappoint over time. Might be exciting initially, but over time it will leave you dead. That's the picture of the NFL. That's the picture of false gods. I remember reading years ago about a dude that committed suicide in the middle of December at the end of the NFL season because he wrote in his suicide note, he wrote in part that his team once again sucked. and it brought him disappointment. So he took out his own life. Listen, you guys, do not exchange your glory for a pigskin. It is Jesus who is your husband, not this world, not the NFL. It's Jesus people turn to or need to turn to in times of trouble, not your football team. It's Jesus who gives hope. It's not your hobby. It's Jesus who's going to return for the wedding supper of the Lamb, not your team returning to the Super Bowl. What will Jesus find when he returns is the question. Will we be ready for him, or will we be distracted? You might remember the parable Jesus told about the bridegroom returning for his bride, and there were 10 bridesmaids. Remember that one? 5 were wise and 5 were foolish. They all fell asleep waiting for him, but the wise one had set oil aside in jars so that when he returned, they could light their lamps. They would have plenty of oil. The foolish 5 didn't have any extra oil. So when the shout went out, when the bridegroom returned, they all woke up. The wise one trimmed their lamps. They added oil. They had light to go with the groom. But the foolish one said, hey, give us some of your oil. And they're like, no, there won't be enough for us and you. Go buy some. So they went off to buy some. And when they came back, they were left in the dark. They knocked on the door and said, open the door to us. But the bridegroom says, I never knew you. No light for them. Friends, don't spend your oil on the false light of this world. In fact, if you want to get over this, and I've left the NFL behind, I think of the NFL as the no, well, I look at it this way, no, comma, false light. In other words, I'm going to say no to that false light. I'm going to save my oil from the true light of the world, which is Jesus. Jesus told us, he said, I am the light of the world. He's the light I'm going to pursue. Listen, there were 2 brides mentioned in the book of Song of Solomon's. One was wise and the other was foolish. The wise one's waiting for her husband. She's waiting on her bed. She's waiting for him to return. And he hasn't yet. So finally she gets up, can't stand it anymore. She goes outside. She begins looking for him all over town all night long. And she finds him and they're together and she's happy. She's full of joy. The other one is foolish. She's dead asleep in her room and on her bed. And the groom comes and he knocks on the door for her to open it. But she's too tired. She's like, oh, must I soil my feet again? I just went to bed. And his hand goes through the lattice and tries to grab the door handle. And that wakes her up and that stirs her up. And she's like, oh, I got to get to my husband. And she tries to get across the room and she staggers over there. She puts her hand on the doorknob, but it's covered with oil and she can't get it open. She finally does, though, and he's gone. So then she goes out like the first bride and she's looking for him all over town. But instead of finding him, she gets beat up in the process. You guys, that's the foolish bride. Which bride are you? If you know the Lord, then let go of this world. Let go of the false gods. Don't get caught up in the NFL or any other hobby thing that takes you away from Jesus. Give your life to Jesus and live for him fully. Have your lamps filled with oil. Have extra oil in jars. Don't let your lamp burn for the NFL. Let it burn for Jesus. And it doesn't matter what you've done. Listen, if you don't know the Lord, it really doesn't matter what you've done in your life. You can find forgiveness in him. That's the beauty of the cross. That's the good news that I have for you today. There is no sin, you guys. There is nothing so grievous that you've committed that Jesus cannot forgive. You see, that's the power of the cross. He died the death you and I deserve so that we can live the life he deserves with him in all eternity. And so to get there, we got to change our thinking. That means repentance, turn away from the way we're thinking. Instead of thinking that everything our life is about is in this world, we begin to think about Jesus and what he's done for us, and we give our lives over to him. We put our faith in him. We trust him as the leader of our lives. And when we do that, he promises abundant life to us now and eternal life to when we leave this place, because he is the light of the world. He is the eternal light that we can be drawn to, not false light. So when you think of the NFL, start thinking about it that, nope, false light, not going there. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to trust in Christ. And I hope you will too. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye for now.